In the previous video, we have introduced Pigou taxes as a very popular remedy for negative externality. Lots of governments use them, and at least in theory, they seem very simple. You figure out what the marginal damage is, and to the extent that you can do that, you then know what the amount of the tax is. Now, in reality, that is not so easy because A, it's not so easy to know what the marginal damage is, and B, it's not so easy to know what the cost function and utility functions of firms and consumers respectively are. So you can imagine that different firms in a market have very different cost functions. You might think about if you think about alcohol production, a large brewery certainly has a very, very different cost function and different marginal costs than a small producer of an IPA. Now, so if we imagine then there would be not one type of firm, but let's say just two, one with very high production costs and one with very low ones, they both would pollute equally much, but maybe the one with but obviously if we levy the same amount of tax, it will have a different effect on the high cost versus the low cost firm. Or there could also be a situation where some firms pollute a lot more by nature, whereas others have a production process that has less pollution. And obviously then they need that firm's production that has less pollution is closer to the optimal level than the amount of production of the firm that pollutes a lot. So when that's the case, what we would need to do in optimum is to set taxes individually for either groups of firms and or consumers, or individually or to groups. Okay, so ideally, if all consumers are different in their behavior, and if all firms are different in their profit maximization, their technology, then we would need to have a different tax rate for each firm and each consumer. And that's obviously not possible, right? There are limits to taxation. You may be able to have two types of taxes as you have them for fuel efficient and less efficient cars, right? Where you pay a higher tax rate for a car that is less fuel efficient, but people are willing to pay it because they want this type of car. But you can't say, okay, you drive a whatever Micra and you drive a BMW from a certain year and you drive a BMW from another year that emits more or less, and so we all tax you at different types. So that is almost impossible because you require so much information as the government that even in even in an Orwell type world we would not get this amount of information. Okay, so this type of price discrimination, what we basically need to give everyone a different price, is impossible. So what we do instead is we set a price, a tax that is the same for everyone. But the problem then is that obviously that tax does not perfectly correct for the market failure, right? Because there are some people who are heavily discouraged by the tax and whose utility level actually decreases a lot, so who suffer a huge welfare loss. And there are others who may not even change their behavior that much. And so their production or consumption is actually at a level that's higher than what would be socially efficient. So this is a challenge with any taxation. And the top public economists in the world are actually working on trying to find solutions to that problem. To what extent can a government, so what are the limits to information acquisition about differences in behavior between people and firms, and to what extent is it feasible then to have taxes that target different parts of the population. Now, another instrument that is often used and works basically the same as a Pigou tax, just the other way around, is a subsidy. Okay, so here you have a positive externality, and so due to, in this case, it's an example for the book where firms that engage in the exploration of oil fields, their private return of doing so is lower than the social return, because obviously there's many other firms that would thrive if there was an oil field discovered. And so what the government can do is to subsidize those firms that engage in this oil field exploration. Basically, they give a subsidy that brings them to what is here the socially optimal amount. It's a bit harder to talk here in this example of a socially optimal. You can also think about it during the COVID pandemic. There was subsidies given to R&D firms or to pharmaceutical firms who were trying to develop a vaccine against coronavirus or against COVID-19. And so you can think about this not as the optimal amount, but the optimal speed. You try to subsidize those firms so that they put more resources towards the development of that vaccine, and that then the subsidy basically reduces their marginal costs. They can devote more effort to that and then develop the vaccine faster. This will be another way of seeing how subsidies work, right? They work through a change in the marginal cost curve. At least that's the case when we talk about subsidies of firms. For consumers, it would be the exact opposite. What would happen is it would basically shift the marginal benefit curve upward, which would also lead to an increase in consumption. What you want. Now there is. So we said initially that there are three types of instruments that a government uses: corrective taxation, subsidies, regulation. But there is actually a fourth one that falls somewhere in between those, which is licenses. So these have become extremely popular in the last 20 years or so. When countries started internationally to try and address the problem of carbon dioxide emissions and more broadly of climate change. So the big problem is that no single firm and also no single country has an incentive to reduce its emissions, right? They just produce as much as they need, and then the pollution is just a byproduct. The problem is, if everyone does that, we have too much pollution and with all the negative knock-on effects. So one way to limit the amount of pollution is to say, well, we simply only allow all firms in a country or in the world or in countries that are participating, we allow all firms to only emit a certain amount jointly. And what we then do is we give every firm a quota, which is called a license, of how much they can pollute. Right? So overall, in Ireland, firms can per year pollute, they can emit so and so many tons of CO2. And that's the cap. And then we tell each firm, you're allowed to pollute that much, and that much. Now, it's obviously not a simple task to figure out who is allowed to pollute what, but governments can use some rules based on past profits or make allowances for certain industries. But the idea here is that firms are only allowed to pollute that much. If they pollute more and are getting caught, they pay a fine. But they can avoid that in the first place by simply trading these permits. So there may be some firms that actually don't even need to pollute that much, so they can sell their permits to pollute to other firms. So what that gives us is, on the one hand, you have a market for pollution, and firms internalize the cost of the pollution. Because if they want to pollute more, they can, but they just have to pay for it. And on the other hand, because the overall amount of CO2 emissions is capped at a level that the government chooses, we can address the problem of high CO2 emissions directly by saying, okay, given our projections about what we need to combat climate change, we need to reduce the emissions by that much. And then we let the firms basically figure this out in the market, how they jointly reach that. And that is a very clever way of doing this, not without its challenges, but it's a lot simpler than taxation, because taxation requires acquiring a lot of information, whereas here the firms reveal their information through their behavior in the market. And the reason for doing this and why this is often better than a tax is shown here. So the tricky thing here is that the government does not know the marginal cost of production. So the government knows maybe there are some firms with high marginal cost and some with low marginal cost. So if there is an equal number of these types of firms, then the expected marginal cost from the perspective of the government is just the average of the two. And so if the government then taxes those firms, it taxes them based on whatever the government thinks is the average marginal cost. But obviously the firms with the low cost, for them, they're facing then a fairly high tax, and the firms with the high marginal cost face a fairly low tax. And so this is actually, the one firm will produce too little, the other firm will produce too much, but overall, whether you actually then hit the optimal amount is questionable. So this is why cap and trade is actually a very, very useful and a very innovative and promising program, especially in such a in an environment where otherwise you would have a lot of lobbying of the government with respect to the setting of the taxes.